"You were the wrong parcel," the Duke of Wolverton growled, looking at the woman who stood in his great cold hall with her travelling-cloak still on and the dust of the road upon her, as a man looks at a delivery sent to the wrong house. "I contracted for one bride. The family has sent me another. You are not the woman I bargained for. You are not even, I am given to understand, a daughter of the house at all, but some poor connection fobbed off upon me in her place. You are, in short, the wrong parcel, delivered in error, and I have a mind to send you back where you came from." He said it to wound, and he had every confidence of his power to wound, for he was a great and a bitter man, the Duke of Wolverton, accustomed to having his cruelty land, and he expected of the poor dependent thing before him exactly what such cruelty usually produced: tears or pleading or the cringing apology of a woman with nowhere else to go, clinging to the position she had been smuggled into. He did not get it. The woman before him, Constance Fenwick, 24, orphaned, penniless, sent that day to a husband who had just told her to her face that she was a parcel, addressed in error, did not weep, nor plead, nor cringe. She looked at him for a long, steady moment, her plain, composed face giving nothing away, and then she did a thing that the Duke of Wolverton, in all his bitter years of bending people to his will, had never had done to him before. She drew from the folds of her cloak the key that his housekeeper had given her not an hour since, the key to the apartments prepared for the new Duchess, the symbol of the place she had been brought there to fill, and she crossed the cold hall, and she set it down upon the table at his elbow, quietly, without a word. And then she went to the great door through which she had so lately entered, and she took hold of it, and she closed it. Not slammed it, closed it with a soft and final click, herself on her own side, between herself and the man who had called her a parcel, shutting herself out of the position he had grudged her, releasing him from the obligation he resented, refusing, in one quiet, unanswerable gesture, to be the clung-to mistaken delivery he had taken her for. If she was the wrong parcel, she would not be kept on sufferance. She would trouble him for nothing. She returned his key and closed his door herself, and stood on the far side of it with her dignity entire, having taken from him in the space of a breath the one satisfaction his cruelty had counted on, which was the satisfaction of seeing her brought low. And the Duke of Wolverton stood alone in his great hall, looking at the key upon the table and the closed door beyond it, and felt, for the first time in more years than he could count, something he had thought himself long past feeling: surprise. He had meant to dismiss a cringing nobody. He had been answered, instead, by a dignity he had not known, a penniless dependent could possess, and though he did not know it yet, and would have laughed to be told it, the closing of that door was not the end of the wrong parcel, but the beginning of the only thing that would ever make the bitter Duke of Wolverton whole. To understand how a penniless dependent came to be standing in the Duke of Wolverton's hall as his unwanted bride, and where she had found the dignity that so confounded him, you must first understand who Constance Fenwick was, and the long, hard schooling that had taught her to keep her own worth when all the world reckoned her at nothing. She was the orphaned daughter of a gentleman of small fortune and large kindness, a country squire of the poorer sort, who had died when Constance was 16, leaving her nothing but a good name, a well-stocked mind, and a heart taught to value the right things, her mother having died years before. With no money and no near family, she had been taken in, as portionless orphans so often are, by a wealthier branch of her mother's people, the Mainwarings, a prosperous and consequential family who received her less from affection than from a sense of what was owed to the connection, and who made her understand from the first the precise terms of her position, that she was a poor relation, dependent on their charity, and must earn her bread by usefulness and gratitude, occupying that cold, uncomfortable place, neither family nor servant, that the dependent gentlewoman knows so well. She had lived among the Mainwarings for 8 years, useful and unthanked, fetching and carrying for her aunt, companion, and unpaid governess, and seamstress and drudge by turns, made always to feel the weight of her obligation and the smallness of her consequence, watching her beautiful cousin Cynthia indulged and adored while she herself was overlooked, slighted, and used. And through those 8 years, Constance Fenwick had learned the one lesson that such a life teaches the strong and breaks the weak upon: how to keep her own soul whole under the steady pressure of being treated as nothing. She had no money, no beauty to speak of, no power, no prospects. She had nothing in all the world that the world counted worth having. But she had her own clear sense of her own worth, held quietly and stubbornly against every slight, rooted not in anything the Mainwarings could give or withhold, but in her own honest knowledge of who she was, a person of integrity, of sense, of a quiet, deep goodness, worth, whatever the world said, a great deal more than the careless treatment she received. She had learned to meet contempt with composure, to do her unthanked work well, to keep her dignity untouched in the face of every humiliation, and to need nothing from anyone, drawing her strength from a source within that no one could reach to spoil. It was a hard-won composure, and it had cost her much, but it had made her, by 24, a woman of a quiet and formidable inner strength, exactly the strength that would, on the worst day of her life, allow her to stand in a stranger's hall, be called a parcel delivered in error, and answer not with tears but with the unbroken dignity of one who knew her own worth, though the whole world had forgotten it. The childhood that gave Constance Fenwick her unbreakable dignity deserves its telling, for the strength that let her return a duke's key and close his door without a tremor was not born in that cold hall, but laid down, year by year, in a happy poor home and tested in a cold rich one. Her early years had been poor but warm. Her father, a country gentleman of small means and large heart, had loved his motherless daughter dearly and raised her, after his fashion, to value the things that cannot be bought: honesty, kindness, a clear conscience, the riches of a thoughtful mind. There had never been money to spare in that small household, but there had been love, and good talk, and books, and the steady example of a man who held his integrity dearer than his comfort. And Constance had grown up secure in the one wealth that matters, the knowledge that she was loved, and that she was, in the ways that count, a person of worth. It was a foundation laid deep, and it would bear in the years to come a great weight of trouble without cracking, for a child raised in the certainty of her own worth carries that certainty within her ever after, into whatever cold places life may send her, and cannot easily be persuaded to surrender it, however the world may sneer. When her father died, that warm, secure world ended at a stroke, and Constance at 16 passed from a poor home full of love to a rich one empty of it. But she carried her foundation with her. The Mainwarings could take her in and use her, could remind her daily of her dependence and her insignificance, could treat her as a thing of no account, but they could not reach the deep place where her father had planted the knowledge of her own worth, and they could not make her believe, however they tried, the thing the world wished her to believe, that a poor dependent was a lesser kind of creature with a lesser claim to dignity and respect. She knew better. She had been loved, she had been valued, she knew what she was, and she held to that knowledge through 8 years of slights and humiliations, as a shipwrecked sailor holds to a spar, and it kept her afloat when a soul without such ballast would have sunk. That was the secret of the composure that so confounded the Duke. Not pride, not coldness, but the deep, unshakable security of a woman who had been loved enough, once, to know her own worth forever, and who could therefore stand in any hall in England, be called any cruel name, and remain untouched at the center of herself, exactly who she had always known herself to be. The Mainwaring household, in which Constance spent the 8 long years of her dependence, deserves describing, for it was the cold school in which her dignity was tempered, and it shows what manner of family it was that could pack off a kinswoman as a fraud to save its own skin. The Mainwarings were rich, respectable, and entirely worldly, a family that measured everything by consequence and reckoned every person by what they were worth to the family's advancement. Mr. Mainwaring was a heavy, self-important man, much occupied with his own dignity. Mrs. Mainwaring, who truly ruled the house, was a sharp, ambitious, cold-hearted woman whose whole soul was bound up in the social rise of her family and the brilliant marriage of her beautiful daughter. Into this household Constance had come, an orphan niece with no money and no power, and the family had assigned her, without cruelty, exactly, but without the smallest warmth, the place that such households reserve for poor relations, a place of perpetual obligation in which she was housed and fed and clothed, and made to understand that the housing and feeding and clothing were a charity to be repaid in full and forever by usefulness, deference, and a becoming sense of her own insignificance. So Constance had earned her bread. She had been her aunt's companion and her cousin's dresser, the family's seamstress and accountant and sick nurse and general convenience, the one who did the unglamorous work that kept the household running and received for it neither wages nor thanks, only the cold continuance of her keep and the constant reminder that she was lucky to have it. She had watched her cousin Cynthia, the family's treasure, indulged in every whim and spared every trouble while she herself was overlooked and used, had eaten the particular bitter bread of the dependent, which is to live in plenty and be allowed to feel none of it her own, and she had borne it, all of it, for 8 years, with a composure that her family mistook for meekness, and that was in truth the dignity of a woman who knew her own worth too well to let their slights touch it. The Mainwarings thought they had broken her to the harness of dependence, had made of her a grateful, biddable drudge who would do as she was bid and be thankful. And so, when their daughter's elopement left them facing ruin, they assumed without a second thought that Constance would do as she was bid in this too, would let herself be packed off as a substitute bride to save them, meekly and without protest. They were right that she would go, for she had no power to refuse. They were wrong about everything else, for the meek drudge they thought they had made was about to show a duke, and in time the world, a dignity and a worth they had never troubled to see in 8 years of using her. The duke himself must be understood next, and the old wound that had made him the cold and bitter man who could greet a frightened bride with so studied a cruelty, for he had not always been so, and the growl with which this story opens was the voice not of a wicked heart, but of a badly broken one. Vincent, Duke of Wolverton, was 36, and he had been, in his youth, a very different man, warm, open, generous, quick to trust and quicker to love, with a heart as ready as any young man's to give itself wholly, and he had given it wholly once. At 23 he had loved, with the whole force of an ardent, untried heart, a beautiful young woman of his own world, had courted her and won her, and been betrothed to her, and had believed himself the happiest man alive, until a fortnight before the wedding she had thrown him over without warning or remorse, jilted him publicly and cruelly for a marquess, with a higher title and a larger fortune, and left him standing humiliated before the whole laughing world, his heart in pieces and his trust in ruins. It is a common enough story, and the world makes light of it, but it does not feel light to the one it happens to, and to the young Duke of Wolverton, who had loved with his whole untried soul, and been betrayed with such cold calculation, it had been a wound from which he never fully recovered. For it taught him, or so he believed, the bitterest of lessons: that love was a delusion and women were deceivers, that the warmth and trust he had offered were a young fool's folly, that the only safety lay in never again giving his heart, his trust, or his good faith to any living soul. And so the warm, open boy had frozen into the cold, bitter man. He armored himself in pride and cynicism. He held the whole world at the icy length of his consequence. He resolved never again to be made a fool of by feeling, and trusted no one, and expected of everyone the same calculated falseness that had broken him. When at last he was obliged to marry, for the dukedom needed an heir, and his own line pressed him, and a man in his position cannot remain forever single, he approached the business as coldly as he approached everything, contracting for a wife as for a broodmare, through lawyers and at a distance, wanting no feeling in it whatsoever, choosing a respectable family and a suitable girl by report, and never troubling to meet her, determined that this marriage, at least, should cost him nothing of the heart he had sworn never to risk again. He would get his heir and keep his distance and feel nothing. That was the plan. And when, on the very threshold of even this loveless bargain, he found himself deceived, again the contracted bride spirited away, a substitute fobbed off upon him, his cold, careful arrangement made a fool of, by yet another scheming family. Every old wound reopened at once, and all his bitterness rose up. And he turned upon the innocent woman before him the accumulated fury of 13 years of distrust, and called her a parcel, delivered in error. He was not at bottom a cruel man. He was a deceived and frozen one, who had decided on the strength of one betrayal that everyone would betray him. And he had no notion, growling at her in his cold hall, that the wrong parcel was about to teach him how wrong that decision had been. The cold, solitary life the Duke had led in the 13 years between his betrayal and his marriage deserves a glance, for it shows what Constance rescued him from, and why the thaw she worked was less a small change than a resurrection. He had not been idle in those years, nor dissipated. That was not his way. He had managed his great estates with cold competence, taken his seat and done his duty, moved through the world with the correct and frigid dignity of his rank. But he had lived, all that time, entirely alone, not in body, for he was surrounded always by servants and dependents and the acquaintance his position required, but in soul, behind a wall of distrust so high and so complete that no one had passed it in 13 years. He had let no one near him. He had formed no friendships, for friendship requires trust, and he trusted no one, had taken no lovers, for he despised the appetite that had once been his undoing, had given his confidence, his affection, his true self to not one living soul, but kept them locked away behind his pride where they could never again be betrayed. It was a safe life by his own grim reckoning. Nothing could hurt a man who let nothing near him. But it was also a dead one, a long gray twilight of the soul, lived without warmth, without intimacy, without love, a careful, changeless cold that he had mistaken for peace because he had forgotten what anything better felt like. This was the life Constance found him in, and the life she ended without ever setting out to. For her honesty breached the wall his distrust had built. Her dignity earned the respect that opened him to her. Her steady goodness, day by day, thawed the frozen ground in which no warmth had grown for 13 years. And her simple companionship gave him back the human closeness he had denied himself so long. She did not set out to rescue him. She set out only to keep her own dignity and trouble him for nothing. But the effect of her presence, of her mere honest, worthy self, living daily within his cold walls, was to bring the frozen man back to life, to give him back his capacity for trust, for warmth, for joy, for love, to thaw not a corner of him, but the whole of him, the whole long-frozen man, until the warm, open soul that had been locked away in the ice for 13 years stood free again, blinking in an unfamiliar sun. It was not a small thing she did for him, though she did it without trying, and he resisted it with all his might. She brought a dead man back to life, and that is why, when he understood it, his gratitude and his love were as deep as the grave she had raised him from. The betrayal that froze the Duke's heart deserves to be told in fuller detail, for it was the wound behind all his cruelty, and a man's cruelty is never understood until its wound is seen. He had been 23, and as warm and open a young man as ever held a great title lightly. The dukedom had come to him young, But it had not spoiled him. He had been generous, frank, quick to like and to be liked, a young man who took the world at its word and gave his trust as freely as his smile. And he had loved, that year, with the whole undefended force of a heart that had never been hurt. The lady was beautiful, accomplished, and seemingly as warm as himself. She had received his addresses with every appearance of returning them. They had been betrothed amid the congratulations of the world, and the young Duke had walked for one bright season in the certainty. He had not known, how should he have known, that her warmth was a performance, her love a calculation, her acceptance of him a placeholder to be discarded the moment a better offer came. The better offer came a fortnight before the wedding, in the person of a marquess, older and richer and higher than the Duke, and the lady, without a qualm, without a word of warning, threw the Duke over and took the marquess, jilting her betrothed publicly, coolly and completely, and leaving him to face the pity and the laughter of the whole world with his heart in ruins and his trust destroyed. It was the calculation of it that did the deepest damage, the cold revelation that the warmth he had believed in had been false from the first, a mask over a mercenary heart. For a man may recover from being unloved, but it goes harder with him to learn that what he took for love was only a clever counterfeit, and hardest of all when he learns it young, before he has any defense against the lesson. The young Duke drew from it the conclusion that such a betrayal so often teaches, that warmth is a mask, that love is a lie, that women deceive and trust is folly, and that the only safety is to feel nothing and believe no one ever again. It was a false lesson drawn from a true pain, but he could not know it was false, having only the one bitter instance to judge by, and he built upon it the cold fortress of the next 13 years, and lived in it alone, until a woman he called the wrong Parcel came, all unknowing. To tear it down, the cold manner in which the Duke set about his marriage, before ever the substitution was thought of, deserves recording, for it shows how thoroughly he had armored himself against feeling, and how the very coldness of his arrangements set the stage for the deception that enraged him. When at last the pressure to marry grew too great to resist, the dukedom wanting an heir, his relations urging his own sense of duty, cold as it was, acknowledging the necessity, the Duke of Wolverton approached the matter exactly as he approached every other tiresome business, with efficiency at a distance and with a determined absence of all feeling. He would marry, since marry he must, but he would do it on terms that risked nothing of the heart he had sworn off. He would not court. Courting was for fools who believed in love. He would not choose for affection, nor even meet his bride beforehand if he could help it. He would simply contract for a suitable wife, as he might contract for any other necessary acquisition, specifying the requirements: good birth, respectable family, nothing scandalous, and leaving the particulars to his man of business and the lady's family to arrange. He wanted a broodmare for the dukedom and a hostess for his table, nothing more. A woman who would bear his heir, grace his houses, and make no claim whatever upon his feelings, which were closed for good. It was a cold way to marry, and it carried, though he did not see it, the seed of its own undoing. For a man who will not meet his own bride, who contracts for a wife by report and portrait and leaves the choosing to others, who treats the whole business as a transaction beneath his personal attention, makes himself the natural prey of exactly the kind of deception that befell him. Had he courted Cynthia, he would have known her for the shallow creature she was and been warned. Had he troubled to meet his bride, no substitution could have been worked upon him. But he had held himself coldly aloof from the whole affair, wanting to feel nothing and to be troubled with nothing. And so he had left a gap through which the Mainwaring's desperate fraud could pass, and had married, sight unseen, a woman who was not the woman named in his contract, and discovered the fact only when it was too late to undo. There was a kind of justice in it, though, a cruel one. The man who had tried to marry without any human contact at all, to acquire a wife as coldly as a horse, was repaid by getting not the wife he had ordered, but another entirely, and was enraged by the deception, without ever perceiving that his own cold contempt for the human heart of the business had invited it. He had wanted no feeling in his marriage, and feeling in the shape of a deception and a fury, and at last a love he never bargained for, was exactly what his marriage was about to force upon him. The beautiful cousin Cynthia deserves her own portrait, for she was the right parcel to Constance's wrong one in all the world's reckoning. And the contrast between them is the whole argument of this tale. Cynthia Mainwaring was a beauty, and had been raised to be nothing else. From her cradle, she had been the family's treasure and its hope, petted and praised and indulged, taught by an adoring mother that her loveliness was her fortune and her future and her whole sufficient worth, and the teaching had borne its usual fruit. It had made her vain, selfish, shallow, and cruel, a young woman dazzling to look upon and hollow within, accustomed to being admired and incapable of admiring anyone else, valuing herself entirely by the effect of her beauty, and valuing others entirely by their usefulness to her. She had treated her poor cousin Constance, through all their years together, with the careless contempt of the beautiful for the plain, the rich for the poor, the indulged for the dependent, had used her as a foil and a servant, mocked her plainness, and never once suspected that the drab cousin she despised possessed a worth beside which her own beauty was a poor thing indeed. It was entirely in character that Cynthia should have brought her family to ruin for a whim, and in character that she should have felt no remorse for it. She had been contracted to the Duke of Wolverton, the greatest match her mother's ambition had ever dreamed of, and she had thrown it away on the eve of the wedding, not from any fine feeling, but from a spoiled girl's appetite for a more amusing present pleasure. Loping with a handsome scoundrel because he flattered her better and demanded less than a cold great duke, careless in her selfishness of the ruin she left behind her, the broken contract, the disgraced family, the cousin who would be sacrificed to mend her mess. And it was entirely in character, too, that when her own folly had ruined her, she should think nothing of coming back to undo, at her cousin's expense, the wreck she had made, should assume, with a vain woman's bottomless self-regard, that the Duke must still want her, that the place she had thrown away was still hers for the taking, that her drab substitute cousin could be brushed aside the moment the true beauty deigned to return. She was the right parcel, in the world's eyes and her own. Beautiful, well-born, the contracted bride. And the whole point of the story is that the world and Cynthia were wrong. That beauty without worth is the emptiest of all deliveries, and that the plain, honest cousin the world had labeled wrong was, by every measure that finally matters, worth 100 of the dazzling one it called right. If you are listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp turned low, the dark drawn gentle and close, the day's small cares set aside, then settle yourself, and let me tell you how the wrong parcel proved the rightest thing the Duke of Wolverton ever received, and how a woman called the delivery sent in error taught a frozen man to trust and to thaw, and at the last to love. For this is a story about a man who judged a whole world guilty for one woman's crime, and the honest soul who showed him his mistake, about worth that the careless reckon wrong and the wise reckon priceless, and about the difference between a thing delivered and a person chosen. I shall tell you, before the end, where in the world I picture you sitting, by what far fire. But first, you must hear how the wrong parcel came to be sent at all, and what it cost a proud, poor woman to be packed off as a substitute to a stranger who did not want her. The substitution that so enraged the Duke had come about through no fault of Constance's, and in circumstances that did her family far less credit than they did her, for she had been sent to Wolverton not as a schemer, but as a sacrifice, packed off to save the Mainwarings from a ruin of their own daughter's making. The marriage had been arranged originally for Cynthia, the beautiful, indulged only daughter of the house, whose dazzling looks had drawn the Duke's cold, contracting eye, by report and by a flattering portrait, as a suitable ornament for his rank. The Mainwarings had been triumphant. A duke for their Cynthia was a height beyond their dreams, and the contract had been signed, the settlements drawn, the great alliance made, all without the Duke and his bride ever meeting, for he cared nothing to court her, and she cared nothing for anything but the title. And then, a few days before the wedding, Cynthia, who wanted the rank, but not the cold, forbidding man attached to it, and who had besides a handsome, penniless lover she preferred, had eloped, run off over the border with her lover in the dead of night, leaving her family ruined, for to jilt a duke, to break so public and so binding a contract, was a scandal that would destroy the Mainwarings utterly, expose them to the Duke's formidable wrath and the world's derision, and blight every other prospect of the family forever. It was Mrs. Dyer Mainwaring, in her terror, who had hit upon the desperate remedy to send Constance in Cynthia's place. There was, she reasoned, a marriage contracted for a young lady of the family. Let a young lady of the family be supplied. The Duke had never seen Cynthia. He wanted only a suitable bride to bear his name and his heir. One well-born young woman would serve as well as another, and need never be the wiser. Constance was of the family, near enough, a Fenwick, a poor relation, but gently born and connected. She was unmarried, presentable, and, being a dependent, in no position to refuse. And so the thing was done, with a haste and a secrecy and a degree of misrepresentation that Constance herself loathed, but was powerless to prevent. She was informed, not asked, that she was to go to Wolverton, in her cousin's place, and be married to the Duke. The marriage was hurried through by special license and the Duke's deputy. Before, he himself had returned from abroad to look at his bride, and Constance, given no real choice in the matter, a penniless dependent at the mercy of the family that fed her, went. But went resolved. Whatever was forced upon her, on this much that was hers to control, that she would not lie. Whatever deception her aunt intended, Constance would practice none. She would go as herself Constance Fenwick, and if the Duke asked her who she was, she would tell him the truth, and take the consequences with what dignity she could. She was sent as a fraud. She was determined to be at least an honest one. And it was that determination, her flat refusal, when the cold, furious Duke confronted her, to pretend to be anyone but herself, that would prove in the end the saving of them both. The hurried, joyless wedding by which Constance became the Duchess of Wolverton deserves a brief account, for it was as strange and cold a marriage-making as ever bound two lives, and its very strangeness is part of why the Duke felt so cheated when he came at last to look at what he had got. There had been no wedding in any sense Constance recognized as one. The Duke being abroad and unwilling to delay, and the family being frantic to have the thing done and binding before any second thoughts could intervene, the marriage had been pushed through by special license with the Duke represented by his deputy, in a small cold ceremony attended by no one who loved either party, and witnessed chiefly by lawyers concerned to see the settlements properly executed. Constance had stood up to be married to a man who was not even present, had pledged herself for life to an absence, a name, a rank, a portrait she had never seen, had become, in the space of a chilly half-hour, the wife of a stranger she would not meet for days, and the Duchess of a house she had never entered. It was less a wedding than a transaction completed. A legal binding rushed through to serve other people's purposes, and Constance had gone through with it because she had no power to do otherwise. But she had felt, standing there, the full strange coldness of being married to no one, for no reason of her own, to save a family that did not love her from the consequences of a folly that was not hers. And it was the very manner of it, the haste, the secrecy, the proxy, the deception that the Duke would not discover until it was too late to prevent, that fed his sense of outrage when he came home. for a man does not like to find himself married in his own absence and by other hands to a woman not of his choosing and not of his contracting, does not like to learn that a thing as grave as his marriage has been concluded behind his back, a substitute slipped into the place he had bargained for. The whole solemn business made a vehicle for someone else's escape from ruin. His pride was outraged quite as much as his expectation. He had been, as he saw it, handled, managed, deceived in his very marriage bed, and the discovery touched every nerve of the distrust that 13 years had made raw. It was no excuse for his cruelty to Constance, who had been as much a victim of the arrangement as he. But it was a reason, and it helps to explain how a man not at bottom cruel came to growl at a frightened woman that she was a parcel delivered in error. He had been married against his knowledge and deceived in the doing of it, and he made the innocent instrument of the deception bear the weight of his anger at the thing itself. The journey to Wolverton and what passed in Constance's mind upon it deserve their place. For it was on that cold road that she made the resolutions that would carry her through everything and steeled herself to meet whatever waited at its end. She had been given almost no time to prepare, and no choice at all. Her aunt had informed her of the plan in a few hurried, agitated sentences. Cynthia gone, the family ruined, the contract to be honored by a substitute, Constance to go in her cousin's place and be married to the Duke without delay, and had brushed aside, with the impatience of a frightened woman, every objection and every question. The marriage had been pushed through with unseemly haste by special license, the Duke himself absent abroad, and represented by his deputy, so that the thing should be done and binding before he could return to prevent it. And Constance, married to a man she had never seen, to a name and a rank and an absence, had been bundled into a carriage and sent off across the country to the great house of a husband who did not know she was coming and would not, when he learned the truth, want her at all. It was a long, cold journey, and she had it to think in. And Constance, being a woman of sense and not of self-deception, used it to look her situation full in the face. She had no illusions about what awaited her. She was being sent as a fraud, a substitute, the wrong bride. The Duke had contracted for her dazzling cousin, and would get instead a plain poor relation. He would be angry, and would have every right to be. She would arrive unwanted, unwelcome, an imposition and an insult, into the household of a cold stranger who might do anything from coldly accepting her to furiously casting her out. She could not change any of it, but she could decide how she would meet it, and on that cold road she made her resolutions, which were 3, and which she kept. She would not lie. Whatever deception her family intended, she would practice none, but tell the Duke the plain truth and let him judge. She would not grovel, however unwanted she was. She would keep her dignity, and not cling, and not beg, and not let any man's contempt make her despise herself. And she would not lose herself. Whatever was done to her, she would remain Constance Fenwick, the woman her father had raised, worth what she had always been worth, however the world or the Duke might reckon her. Armored with these 3 resolutions, and with nothing else in the world but the clothes she wore and the dignity she carried, she came at last, on a grey afternoon, to the great, cold gates of Wolverton, and went in to meet her fate. The honesty she had resolved upon was put to the test within minutes of her arrival, and it was the manner of her answering that turned the Duke's contempt against his will into the first unwilling flicker of respect. For when the Duke of Wolverton, newly returned and in a black temper, had come down to inspect the bride who had been married to him in his absence, and had looked at the plain, quiet woman in her travelling-cloak, and known at once, with a falling fury, that this was not the dazzling beauty of the portrait when he had demanded, cold and dangerous, who she was and what trick had been played on him. Constance had not faltered, nor lied, nor tried to brazen out the deception her aunt had intended. She had told him the truth, plainly and at once, that she was Constance Fenwick, a poor relation of the Mainwarings. that her cousin Cynthia, the lady he had contracted for, had eloped, that the family, to save the alliance and themselves, had sent her in Cynthia's place, that she had been given no choice in the matter, but that she would not deceive him about it, and would tell him exactly how things stood and leave him to do as he thought right. She had laid the whole shameful truth before him, sparing neither her family nor herself, with a steady honesty that asked for nothing and excused nothing, and then she had stood and waited for his judgment, neither defiant nor pleading, simply honest and composed. It was then that he had growled his cruelty at her. "You were the wrong parcel," striking out, in his reopened pain, at the nearest object of it. And it was then that she had returned his key and closed his door herself, refusing the humiliation he had meant to inflict. But even in the white heat of his anger, something in her honesty had reached him, had lodged like a splinter beneath the skin of his fury, and would not be dislodged. For the Duke of Wolverton had built his whole bitter philosophy on the certainty that women deceived. He had braced himself, coming down to that hall, to be lied to, flattered, manipulated, cozened by a scheming substitute trying to make the best of a fraud, and instead he had been met with a flat, unflinching, almost reckless honesty. A woman who told him the worst truth about herself, without being asked and without trying to soften it, who practiced upon him not the smallest art, who seemed, astonishingly, to value her own honesty above her own advantage. It did not fit, it contradicted everything he believed about her kind. And though he growled and dismissed her, and told himself she was a nobody to be sent back or ignored, the splinter of her honesty stayed in him, and that night alone, the Duke of Wolverton found himself thinking, against his will and to his considerable annoyance, not of how to be rid of the wrong parcel, but of the strange unwelcome fact that the wrong parcel had told him the truth. The moment of the key and the closed door deserves to be dwelt on more fully, for it was the hinge on which the whole story turned, and it is worth understanding exactly what Constance did and why it struck the Duke as nothing else could have. Consider her situation as she stood in that cold hall. She was penniless, friendless, and entirely in the Duke's power. She had been married to him, and the marriage could not easily be undone. She had nowhere else in the world to go. No family that wanted her, no means to support herself, no refuge from his displeasure. Every consideration of prudence and self-interest urged her to placate him, to apologize, to plead, to make herself agreeable, to cling to the position she had been smuggled into, for it was the only security she had or was ever likely to have. A weaker or a more calculating woman would have wept, or flattered, or thrown herself on his mercy, or schemed to soften him. For she had everything to lose by defiance and everything to gain by submission. And Constance did none of it. Told she was the wrong parcel, threatened with being sent back, she answered not with pleading, but with the quiet, unanswerable dignity of returning his key and closing his door herself. It was, in its way, an act of breathtaking courage, though it looked like nothing more than a quiet gesture, for she staked everything on it. She refused in that moment to buy her security at the price of her self-respect, refused to be kept on sufferance, to cling where she was not wanted, to let a man's contempt reduce her to a cringing dependent, grateful for any scrap of toleration. If he would not have her as a wife with dignity, she would not be his wife on her knees. She returned his key and closed his door and stood ready, if it came to that, to walk penniless into the world, rather than be kept as an heir too cowed to know her own worth. And that, precisely that, was what reached the Duke of Wolverton as no plea or flattery ever could have, for he had braced himself for the arts of a schemer, the wiles of a woman trying to secure her advantage. And he was met instead with a woman who plainly valued her dignity above her advantage, who would not stoop to win him, who answered his cruelty by quietly removing herself from its reach. It contradicted everything his bitterness expected. It was the act of a woman with something his betrayer had never had, which was honor, and the splinter of it lodged in him in that first hour, and began, against all his will, the slow work of his thawing. She had meant only to keep her own self-respect. She had, without knowing it, done the one thing in all the world that could pierce the armor of a man who trusted no one. She had shown him a woman who could not be bought, not even with her own security, and who therefore could not be the calculating deceiver his whole creed insisted every woman was. Though he told himself it was only because the scandal of doing so would be worse than keeping her, and so began the cold, strange marriage of the Duke and the wrong Parcel, in which a woman who had been told she was unwanted set herself, with quiet dignity, to want nothing in return. He kept her, but he did not welcome her. He installed her as his Duchess, since married to her he was, and married he must remain, but he made plain, in 100 cold ways, that she was tolerated and not desired, an error he had decided to live with rather than a wife he had chosen. He did not visit her apartments, he barely spoke to her beyond the chill civility of strangers. He went about his own life, and left her to find what place she could in the great forbidding house, with no more warmth than he would have shown an unwelcome guest he could not turn out. And Constance, for her part, having returned his key and closed his door, kept to the spirit of that gesture. She asked him for nothing, expected nothing, imposed herself nowhere. She would not cling to a man who did not want her, nor angle for a regard he had refused her, nor play the wounded wife begging for crumbs of affection. If she was the wrong Parcel, kept on sufferance, she would at least be no burden and no nuisance. She would keep her dignity, hold to her own self, and trouble him for nothing at all. But she did not, for all that, sink into misery or idleness, for that was not her way, and she had learned long ago how to make a life worth living out of unpromising materials. She took the great cold house in hand, for it wanted a mistress, having had none in living memory, and the servants, leaderless and uncertain, were glad enough of one who knew her business. She learned the household, won the staff, by her quiet competence and unfailing fairness, brought warmth and order where there had been only chill neglect. She walked the great estate and came to know its people, and began the small, steady works of care that make a duchess loved. And in her own apartments, in the long, solitary evenings, she lived the rich inner life that had always been her refuge, reading and thinking and keeping her own counsel, content, if not happy, in the knowledge that whatever the Duke thought of her, she had not lost herself. She was the unwanted wife of a cold, bitter man, kept on sufferance in a house where she had been told she did not belong, and she made of even that a life of quiet dignity and quiet use, asking nothing, complaining of nothing, and waiting on nothing, least of all, on the regard of the husband who had called her a Parcel. It was the very last thing he expected of the cringing nobody he thought he had married. And it was, though neither of them knew it, the slow beginning of his thaw. The place Constance made for herself among the people of the Wolverton estate, in her months as its unwanted mistress, deserves its own telling. For her worth showed not only in her dealings with the Duke, but in her daily goodness to the humble, and it was part of what made her, in time, beloved for miles around. The Wolverton tenants had fared no better than the Wolverton servants under a succession of cold masters. The old Duke had been a hard landlord, and the young one an indifferent one, knowing nothing of his people and caring less. And the cottages and farms of his great estate, though not exactly neglected, had been managed at arm's length as a source of revenue rather than as the homes of living souls. Into this Constance came, and brought, as she brought everywhere, the warmth of a heart that could not see a need without wishing to meet it. She walked the estate, as no mistress of Wolverton had done in living memory. She came to know the families in the cottages, learned their names and their troubles, sat with the sick and the aged, found out where there was real want, and quietly relieved it. She did it, not as a great lady dispensing charity for the credit of it, but as a woman who had herself known poverty and dependence and could not bear to see them where she had the power to ease them, with a real interest, a real kindness, a real respect for the dignity of the poor that the poor are quick to feel and slow to forget. And the people of Wolverton, who had braced themselves to think little of the substitute Duchess, their cold master, so plainly scorned, came within a season to love her as they had never loved any soul connected with that cold house. The blessing of the poor went up on her name, the faces in the cottages lit when she passed, and there grew up, around the new Duchess, all unobserved by the great world, that truest and least counterfeitable of reputations, the love of the humble for one who has been good to them. The Duke, when at last he opened his eyes to his own house, saw this too, as he saw everything she did, saw the place his despised wife had won in the hearts of his own people, the warmth she had brought to the cold corners of his estate, the unbought blessing that followed her everywhere. And it was one more proof, added to all the rest, that the wrong Parcel was a woman of rare and genuine worth, for the love of those one has no need to please, freely given to one who has nothing to gain by earning it, is a testimony to character that the shrewdest cynic cannot explain away, and the Duke of Wolverton, for all his bitterness, was shrewd enough to know it for what it was. The way Constance won the great cold house of Wolverton in the weeks of her unwelcome residence deserves its telling, for she conquered the household long before she conquered its master, and the manner of it revealed the quality the Duke was too proud at first to see. Wolverton had been a house without a mistress for a generation, and it showed. The old Duke had been a hard, cold man, and the young one colder. The servants had grown slack and dispirited under a master who noticed nothing of their comfort and cared nothing for their loyalty. The great rooms were kept but not cherished, clean but joyless, a magnificent cold shell with no heart in it. Into this Constance came, unwanted and unwelcomed, with no authority but what her uncertain position gave her, and no welcome from the master who had called her a parcel, and she might have shrunk into her apartments and let the cold house go its cold way. Instead, having decided to make a life rather than mope through one, she quietly took the household in hand, not with the airs of a great lady, for she had never been one, but with the practical competence of a woman who had run a difficult house on slender means, and knew exactly how it was done. And the house responded to her as a neglected garden responds to a gardener. She learned the servants' names and their histories and their troubles. She set right 100 small injustices and inefficiencies that a careless master had let fester. She brought order where there had been muddle and a quiet kindness where there had been only cold command. She noticed and remembered and cared in 100 small daily ways, and the household starved of such notice gave her in return a loyalty and an affection it had never given the cold dukes who paid its wages. Within a few weeks, the servants of Wolverton, who had braced themselves to despise the substitute nobody their master so plainly scorned, were her devoted partisans to a man, and the great cold house had begun, under her quiet hand, to warm into something like a home. The Duke saw it, though he said nothing, saw the change in his household, the new warmth and order, the way the servants' faces lit when their new mistress passed, the way the great dead house had quietly come alive. And it was one more thing that did not fit his theory of her, one more piece of the accumulating evidence that the wrong Parcel was a woman of real and unmistakable worth. For the love of those who serve you, freely given and unbought, is a testimony that no scheming can counterfeit. And the Duke of Wolverton was too shrewd a man not to know it. The old nurse who had raised the Duke and who became Constance's truest ally in that cold house deserves her own introduction, for she alone among them all remembered the warm boy beneath the frozen man, and she alone saw at once what the new Duchess might be the saving of. Mrs. Dar. Probert had been the Duke's nurse when he was a small, motherless boy, and had never left Wolverton, having risen in the years since to be its housekeeper, and in her own unofficial way the keeper of its conscience. A shrewd, warm, plain-spoken old woman of near 70, who had known the Duke since before he could walk and loved him still. Beneath all his coldness, with the unshakable love of a nurse for the child she has reared, and Mrs. Probert grieved over what her boy had become. She remembered him as he had been before. His heart was broken, warm, laughing, generous, quick to love, and she had watched, with a helpless sorrow, the betrayal of his youth freeze all that warmth into the cold, bitter armor he had worn for 13 years. She had longed all that time for something to thaw him, to give her back the boy she had loved, and she had long since given up hope of it, supposing the ice gone too deep ever to melt. So it was with a sharp and hopeful interest that old Mrs. Probert observed the coming of the new Duchess, and the strange effect she seemed, without trying to be, having on the master. She had taken Constance's measure at once, with the unerring eye of an old servant who has seen every kind of person come and go, had seen past the plain face and the dusty travelling-cloak to the dignity and the honesty and the deep good heart beneath, and had known, with the certainty of long wisdom, that here was quality, real quality, the rarest and the best kind. And she had seen, too, what no one else yet dared to see, that the master, for all his growling and his coldness, was not indifferent to his unwanted wife, but watched her, and was troubled by her, and was, though he would have denied it furiously, beginning to thaw. Mrs. Growler. Probert set herself, therefore, with the quiet cunning of an old woman who knows her household better than its master does, to help the thing along, to befriend the lonely young Duchess and ease her way, to drop, in the Duke's hearing, the small, shrewd words that might nudge him toward seeing what was before him, to remind him, when she dared, of the warm boy he had been and might be again. She became Constance's friend, her ally, her one source of warmth in that cold house, and she became, in her humble, unobtrusive way, one of the quiet architects of everything that followed, the old nurse who had never stopped loving the frozen Duke, and who saw, in the wrong Parcel, the one woman who might at last bring her boy back to life. The change in the Duke came slowly and against his every wish, and it began, not with any softening of his heart, but with the simple accumulation of evidence that the wrong Parcel was nothing at all like the woman his bitterness had assumed her to be. For he watched her in those first cold weeks, with the wary, suspicious eye of a man waiting to catch a deceiver in her deception, and what he saw week by week refused to fit his theory of her. He waited for her to angle for his regard, to soften him with wiles, to play upon his guilt or his pity for her own advantage, as a scheming woman in her position surely would. And she did none of it, but kept her dignified distance, asked him for nothing, and seemed maddeningly not to want anything from him at all. He waited to find her sulking or scheming, or making mischief among the servants, or running up his bills, or behaving in any of the ways his cynicism predicted, and instead he found her winning the love of his household by her goodness, ordering his neglected house with quiet competence, treating his tenants with a kindness that made them bless her name, and bearing his own coldness with a composure that neither reproached him nor begged him. He had told himself she was a fraud, a schemer, a deceiver like all her sex, and the longer he watched, the more impossible it became to sustain the charge, for everything she did contradicted it. She was honest where he had expected guile, dignified where he had expected cringing, kind where he had expected calculation, and entirely without the arts and wiles he had armored himself against. And little by little the splinter of her honesty that had lodged in him on that first day worked its way deeper, and began to do its quiet work upon the frozen mass of his distrust. For the Duke of Wolverton's whole bitterness rested upon a single belief, that women deceived, that warmth was a trap, that no one could be trusted, and here, under his own roof, was a living daily refutation of it. A woman who did not deceive, who asked nothing, who was exactly and only what she seemed, whose honesty he could not catch out. However he watched for the crack in it, it troubled him. It contradicted the lesson of his life, the lesson on which he had built 13 years of cold safety, and a man cannot live alongside a daily contradiction of his deepest belief without, in time, being forced to question the belief. He began, almost angrily, to wonder whether he had been wrong about her. And from wondering whether he had been wrong about her, it was a shorter step than he knew to wondering whether he had been wrong about a great many things, whether the one woman who had betrayed him 13 years gone had taught him a true lesson about all women, or only a false one about herself. The wrong Parcel was beginning, simply by being honestly what she was, to thaw the frozen Duke of Wolverton, and he resented it and could not stop it, and did not, in his secret heart, altogether wish to. The first real conversation between the Duke and his unwanted wife, the one that turned his wary watching into something warmer, deserves to be recalled, for it was the moment he first met her mind and found it a match for his own. It had begun, as such things did with him, under a cold pretext. There was a question about the estate, some matter of a disputed boundary or a tenant's grievance, on which he found, to his faint surprise, that his wife had formed an opinion, having walked the land and talked with the people in a way he never troubled to, and he had questioned her about it, meaning at first only to expose the presumption of a woman meddling in his affairs. But her answers had been so sensible, so well-informed, so clearly the fruit of real thought and real observation, that his cold cross-examination had turned, almost against his will, into a genuine discussion, and the discussion had ranged as good talk will, beyond its starting point, until the Duke found himself in the unfamiliar position of conversing, really conversing, mind to mind, with another person, for the first time in his solitary bitter years. And what he found in that conversation both pleased and disturbed him. He found that his wife had a mind worth talking to, clear, well-furnished, independent, capable of meeting his own and of differing from it with a reasoned firmness that he could not despise. He found that she did not flatter him, nor defer to him, nor perform the pretty agreement that bored him in other women, but said what she truly thought, and defended it, and was not afraid of him. He found, in short, an equal, and an equal where he had expected a cipher, in the person of the poor relation he had called a Parcel. It disturbed his settled contempt for her. It disturbed more deeply his settled contempt for her sex, for here was a woman whose company was a pleasure rather than a duty, whose mind he respected, whose conversation he found himself, when it ended, sorry to see end. He went away from that first conversation telling himself it signified nothing, and he came back the next evening on another cold pretext to have another. And so, by pretext after pretext, the cold strangers became, without either quite admitting it, companion, and the frost between them began to give way to the first uncertain warmth of a real regard. Once the Duke had begun, however unwillingly, to revise his opinion of his wife, the revising went fast, for there was a great deal in her to discover, and he found himself, to his own continued annoyance, wanting to discover it. He began to seek her company, at first under cold pretexts, a question about the household, a matter of the estate, some business that gave him an excuse to speak with her without admitting that he wished to. And in those guarded exchanges he found, as he had half begun to suspect, that there was far more to the wrong Parcel than a poor relation's meek usefulness. She had a mind, a good one, well-furnished and independent, that met his own and was not afraid to differ from it. She had a dry, quiet humor that surprised him into the unfamiliar exercise of laughter. She had opinions, arrived at honestly and held without vanity, on 100 matters he had not expected a dependent gentlewoman. The cold businesslike exchanges grew longer and warmer, and turned by degrees into conversation, real conversation, the kind he had not had with anyone in his bitter solitary years. And the Duke of Wolverton discovered, with a feeling he could not name, that he looked forward to the hours in his wife's company, that the great house seemed less cold when she was in it, that the frozen round of his days had begun almost imperceptibly to thaw towards something like warmth. It frightened him. This thaw when he let himself notice it, for warmth was the very thing he had sworn off 13 years before. Warmth had betrayed him once, and he had vowed never to risk it again, and here it was creeping back into his frozen life through the agency of a woman he had called a Parcel. He fought it by fits, would retreat into his old coldness, hold her off, remind himself of the lesson of his ruin. But the thaw, once begun, would not be wholly stopped, for the source of it was not some passing fancy, but the steady daily proof of her worth, and you cannot unknow a thing once you have truly seen it. He had seen that she was honest, he had seen that she was good, he had seen that she was clever and kind and dignified and brave. He had seen, in short, that she was everything he had assumed she was not, and that his bitter creed had been, at least in her case, simply false. And a man who has seen that the lesson of his life was wrong in one case cannot help wondering whether it was wrong altogether. And a frozen man who has felt, after long winter, the first unmistakable warmth of a returning spring cannot, however he fears it, quite bring himself to wish the spring away. He was thawing, the Duke of Wolverton, slowly and against his will, and with a fear he could not master, and the wrong Parcel, who had set out only to keep her own dignity and trouble him for nothing, was unmaking, simply by being herself, the whole cold fortress of his bitterness. There was one evening, in the midst of the slow thaw, that deserves its own remembering, for it was the first time the Duke and Constance sat together, not as wary adversaries, nor as master and dependent, but simply as two people glad of each other's company, and it showed them both, though neither said it, what their marriage might become. It was a wild night of autumn wind and rain, and the Duke, finding the great drawing-room too cold and cavernous for comfort, had come, almost without intending it, to the small warm sitting-room where his wife sat reading by the fire, and instead of withdrawing, as his pride half prompted him, he had stayed. They had talked at first of nothing, the weather, a book, some small matter of the house, and then, as the fire burned low and the wind howled comfortably without, of larger things, of the books they had loved, the places they had seen or wished to see, the thoughts that a solitary life on both their parts had given each of them leisure to think. And the talk had been easy and warm and unguarded in a way that startled them both, for they discovered that evening that they liked one another, not merely respected, not merely tolerated, but liked, found pleasure in, were comfortable with. And the discovery was a sweet and a strange one to two people who had each lived so long without it. The Duke went up to bed that night in a state of mind he had not known in 13 years, not the cold safety he had cultivated, nor the wary armor he had worn, but something warmer and more dangerous and more alive, the simple, unfamiliar contentment of a man who has spent a happy evening in company he is sorry to leave. And Constance, banking her own small fire, found her careful armor harder than ever to keep in place. For it is one thing to want nothing from a man who is cold to you, and quite another to want nothing from a man whose company has just made you, for an hour, forget that you were ever lonely. They had glimpsed it that wild, warm evening, the thing their cold, strange marriage might yet become. Not a transaction, not a toleration, but a true companionship. Two solitary souls grown warm in each other's company. Neither dared yet to name it or to hope too much from it. But each carried the memory of that evening through the difficult days that followed, a small warm coal kept against the cold, and when after all the trouble and the flight and the reconciliation, they came home at last to their true marriage, it was the easy warmth of that one wild night that they were coming home to, multiplied across all the evenings of a long and happy life. The struggle within the Duke, as the thaw advanced and his fear fought against it, deserves its tracing, for he did not surrender to the warmth easily, but resisted it with all the strength of 13 years' hard resolve, and the contest was the true drama of those weeks. For the thaw frightened him, and the more it advanced, the more it frightened him. He had built his whole life, since his betrayal, on the principle of feeling nothing and trusting no one. That principle had kept him safe as he saw it, from ever being hurt again, and now here was that safety crumbling. Here was warmth creeping back into his frozen heart. Here was trust. Of all the dangerous follies beginning to grow toward a woman, when the one time he had trusted a woman it had nearly destroyed him. Every instinct of self-preservation he had cultivated for 13 years cried out against it, and so he fought it. He would spend a warm evening in his wife's company, and then, alarmed at his own warmth, retreat the next day into a pointed coldness, holding her off, reminding himself of the lesson of his ruin, punishing her almost for the feeling she stirred in him. He would catch himself looking forward to her company and force himself to stay away, would feel the ice thawing and deliberately freeze it again, would tell himself sternly that he had learned his lesson about women and would not be fooled twice. But it was a losing battle, and some part of him knew it, for his resistance was founded on a belief that her every act refuted. He was fighting to maintain a distrust that the daily evidence of her honesty made daily more absurd. He could hold off the warmth by an act of will, but he could not unsee what he had seen, that she was honest, good, dignified, and true, the living opposite of the woman who had broken him. And a man cannot indefinitely sustain a fear that reality keeps contradicting. The contradiction wears the fear away, however he clings to it. Day by day, despite his every effort, the thaw advanced and the fear retreated. The warmth he fought kept returning. The trust he forbade kept growing. And the Duke of Wolverton found himself, to his alarm and against his will, becoming attached, deeply, dangerously attached, to the wife he had meant only to tolerate. He did not call it love, even to himself. He was not ready for that. But he had begun, after 13 frozen years, to feel. Again. And feeling, once it begins to return to a frozen heart, is not easily commanded to stop. Constance's own heart, through these same weeks, deserves its account, for she was no passive object of the Duke's thawing, but a woman with feelings of her own, guarded as carefully and surrendered as warily as his. She had come to Wolverton expecting nothing and wanting nothing from her husband, armored against hope by her 3 resolutions and her hard experience. And at first the armor had held perfectly, for the cold, cruel man who had called her a parcel was easy enough to want nothing from. But as the weeks passed and the man began against his own will to change, as the coldness gave way to civility and the civility to conversation, as she discovered, beneath the bitter Duke, a mind worth meeting, and more dangerously the wreck of a warmer man, struggling back toward the light. She was lonely for all her composure. She was young, and the slow unbending of her formidable husband, the dawning of warmth in a face that had first growled at her, the discovery that he was not, after all, simply cruel but deeply wounded, touched her against her will and stirred in her a tenderness she had not bargained for she did not trust it, in him or in herself. She had not forgotten that she was the wrong parcel, the substitute, the bride he had not wanted, and had only been tricked into keeping, and she could not let herself believe that any warmth he showed her was more than the thawing of a lonely man toward the only company at hand, a thing that the return of his true desire, or the sight of a more dazzling woman, might undo in an hour. She guarded her growing tenderness as fiercely as he guarded his, and for a kindred reason, because she feared to hope, feared to stake her hard-won peace on the regard of a man who had begun by despising her, feared above all to let herself love him and then be reminded, as she surely would be. So the two of them moved toward each other. Through those weeks, like two people crossing thin ice, each drawn and each afraid, each guarding a growing feeling neither dared to name, each held back by an old wound, his the betrayal that taught him not to trust, hers the long scorn that taught her not to hope. And it was into this delicate, half-acknowledged drawing together this fragile growing thing that a word might have brought to flower, that Cynthia Mainwaring came sweeping back, like a frost in spring, to remind them both of exactly the fears they were each trying so hard to overcome. It was just as the frost between them had begun to give way to something warmer that the past returned to threaten everything. For Cynthia Mainwaring came back, her elopement ended in disaster, her beauty her only remaining capital, and set herself, with a vain woman's cool effrontery, to reclaim the place she had thrown away. Her elopement had gone as such things often go. The handsome, penniless lover for whom she had jilted a duke had proved as faithless as he was poor. He had spent what little she had, wearied of her within a season, and abandoned her at last, leaving Cynthia ruined in reputation and fortune both, with nothing left of her great gamble. And as she contemplated the wreck of her prospects, her thoughts had turned, with the cold practicality that underlay all her beauty, to Wolverton. The Duke, after all, had wanted her once. The marriage had been all but hers, and in her vanity she could not believe that the cold, dull substitute her mother had sent in her place, her drab, poor cousin Constance of all creatures, could have made the smallest impression on a man who had been promised Cynthia. Surely, she reasoned, the Duke must regret the exchange. Surely he could be brought, by the sight of the beauty he had been cheated of, to wish the wrong parcel away and take the right one after all. For a marriage to a poor relation, hastily made and never desired, was surely a thing that could be set aside by a duke of sufficient determination, one in favor of the woman he had truly wanted. And so Cynthia came to Wolverton, uninvited and unabashed, on the pretext of a family visit to her cousin, the new Duchess, and set herself at once to her work, to dazzle the Duke, to remind him of what he had been promised and cheated of, to make poor plain Constance look the drab substitute she was beside Cynthia's dazzling beauty, and to insinuate, with all a beauty's practiced art, that the Duke had been wronged and might yet have what he had been denied. She flirted, she sparkled, she displayed. She made sly, cruel comparisons between herself and her cousin. She reminded the Duke and Constance and the whole household at every turn that she was the bride he had contracted for, and Constance only the error sent in her place. And Constance, who saw exactly what her beautiful cousin was about, and who had no defense against it but her dignity, felt the old wound reopen, the wound of being the wrong parcel, the substitute, the second choice, the one the Duke had never wanted, and had only been tricked into keeping. For Cynthia's return forced upon her the cruel question she had tried not to ask, even if the Duke's coldness was thawing, even if he had come to value her a little. Was it not all built on resignation to a mistake? And might not the sight of the beauty he had truly been promised undo it in an hour, and leave Constance exactly what she had been called on her first day, the wrong parcel, kept only because the right one had been unavailable? Cynthia's campaign at Wolverton deserves a closer look, for it was a study in the arts of a beautiful selfish woman, and its very confidence was the measure of how little she understood the man she meant to recapture or the cousin she meant to displace. She had arrived all charm and contrition, the picture of a chastened beauty come to make amends, had embraced her cousin with a great show of affection before the household, and professed herself only too glad to see dear Constance so well established, while contriving in the same breath, by 100 small arts, to remind everyone present that the establishment had been meant for herself. And once installed as a guest, she had set about her real work with the practiced skill of a woman who had never doubted her power to charm. She dressed to dazzle, she sparkled at dinner, she turned upon the Duke the full battery of the beauty and the wit and the flattering attention that had once, she was sure, all but won him. She contrived to be always at her best where he could see her, and to show her drab cousin, always at a disadvantage beside her, made sly comparisons, dropped honeyed reminders that she was the bride he had chosen, played with consummate skill upon the supposed regret of a man cheated of a beauty and saddled with a substitute. What Cynthia could not conceive, for it lay entirely outside her understanding of the world, was that her whole campaign was founded on a falsehood. She assumed the Duke must want her, because she was beautiful and Constance was not, and because beauty was, in Cynthia's philosophy, the only thing a man could possibly want. She assumed that beauty would always defeat plainness, that dazzle would always defeat worth, that the Duke must be as shallow as herself, and therefore as easily recaptured by a pretty face. And she was wrong on every count, for the Duke of Wolverton, whatever his faults, was no fool, and the weeks with Constance had taught him, though he had not yet fully owned it, the difference between the beauty that dazzles and the worth that lasts. Cynthia's arts, which would have told upon a shallow man, told nothing upon a man who had learned to see beneath the surface. Her dazzle, set beside Constance's quiet worth, only showed the more plainly how little there was beneath it. She thought she was winning him back. She was in truth with every flutter and every barb, teaching him more surely how much he preferred the cousin she despised. But Constance, who could not read the Duke's heart and feared the worst, saw only the dazzling beauty laying claim to him, and felt only the old wound of being the wrong parcel pressed cruelly afresh. And so Cynthia's doomed campaign, which was winning the Duke for Constance, was at the same time driving Constance toward the door. The depth of the wound that Cynthia's return reopened in Constance deserves fuller understanding. For it was not jealousy exactly, but something that struck at the very root of her hard-won peace, and it explains why she chose flight over fighting. For Constance's whole dignity, through all her dependent years and through the strange weeks of her marriage, had rested on a single foundation: her refusal to accept the world's low valuation of her, her stubborn private certainty of her own worth. She had borne being a poor relation, being overlooked, being used, even being called a parcel, by holding fast to the inner knowledge that she was, whatever the world said, a person of real worth. And she had begun, in the warming weeks before Cynthia came, to let herself half believe the impossible thing: that she might be valued at last, not as an error, tolerated, but as a woman prized. Cynthia's return shattered that fragile hope, and worse, it threatened the foundation beneath it. For Cynthia was the living embodiment of the verdict. Constance had spent her life refusing. The beautiful, the desired, the right parcel, beside whom Constance was by the world's reckoning exactly the drab substitute she had been called. To watch the Duke in Cynthia's dazzling company was to be shown in the cruelest possible form the thing she most feared, that the world might be right after all, that beauty was what men wanted, that she herself was and always would be the second best, the makeshift, the one chosen only because the real prize was unavailable. And that fear, the fear that the world's low valuation might be the true one, was the one thing Constance's dignity could not survive intact. For her dignity depended on her not believing it, and Cynthia's presence made it harder and harder not to believe. She could bear to be unwanted by the Duke. She had expected that from the first. What she could not bear was to be kept as a visible second best, fought over or compared or pitied, while the beauty she could never rival held the field. Could not bear to stay and watch herself diminish daily into exactly the wrong parcel she had refused on her first day to be. And so her choice to leave was not weakness, nor a fit of jealous pique, but the last defense of the only thing she had ever truly possessed, her own dignity, her own refusal to be reduced to the world's contemptuous reckoning of her. Rather than stay and be slowly ground down into the second best the world insisted she was, she would take herself away whole, with her worth and her dignity intact, and seek her own living in the world sooner than be kept on sufferance as the error of beauty had been preferred to. It was the key returned, and the door closed, once more and for good, and it was like the first time, an act not of defeat, but of a fierce, unbroken self-respect. The crisis came to a head one evening when Cynthia's campaign reached its boldest stroke, and Constance, unable to bear being made a public spectacle of her own supposed inferiority, made the decision that brought everything to its breaking point. She resolved to leave. For Cynthia had grown bolder as the days passed, and the Duke, courteous to a guest beneath his roof, gave her no open rebuff. Bolder until, one evening before the assembled household and a few country neighbors, she went too far, making, with honeyed malice, some public comparison of herself and her cousin. Some pointed reminder that she was the lady the Duke had chosen, and Constance the makeshift sent in her stead, framed as a jest but barbed to wound. And Constance, who had borne so much with composure, found that there was one thing she could not bear, which was to stand publicly accused of being a usurper in a place not rightly hers, an error clung to, a wrong parcel kept against the rightful claimant. Her dignity, which had carried her through every private slight, rose up against this public one, and she made, that night, in the cold clarity of her hurt, a decision worthy of the woman who had returned the Duke's key on her first day. She would not stay to be fought over or compared, or made the visible symbol of the Duke's misfortune. She would remove herself. She would go, leave Wolverton, release the Duke from the error of her, take herself and her unwanted presence out of a situation that her staying only made worse. And if the Duke wanted Cynthia or freedom or anything at all, he should have it, done hampered by a wrong parcel, too proud to be kept on sufferance, and too honest to fight for a place she had been told was not hers. She did not make a scene of it, that was not her way. She simply went, the next morning, quietly, with her few possessions and her dignity intact, leaving behind a short, honest letter for the Duke, that she perceived she had been, from the first, an error and an imposition, that she would not be the cause of discord in his house, nor the obstacle to his happiness, that she released him, so far as it lay in her power, from the unwanted bargain her family had forced upon him, and that she asked nothing of him but to be allowed to go quietly and trouble him no more. It was the key, returned and the door closed again, but in earnest now, and for good. The final gesture of a woman who would sooner give up everything, position and security, and the man she had against all sense come to love, than cling to a place where she was not truly wanted. She had been sent to Wolverton as the wrong parcel, and rather than be kept as one, she would take herself away. And it was only when she had gone, and the great house stood suddenly empty of the quiet presence that had, without his noticing, become the warmth at its heart, that the Duke of Wolverton discovered, all at once and with the force of a blow, exactly how wrong he had been, and exactly how much he stood to lose. What the Duke felt, in the hours after he found her gone, deserves to be dwelt on, for it was in that desolation that the last of his frozen pride melted, and he understood at last, too late as he feared, what he had nearly thrown away. He had not known, until she was gone, how large a place she had come to fill. He had told himself, through all the weeks of his thawing, that she was merely a tolerable companion, a wife better than he had expected, a convenience he had grown used to. He had not let himself measure how much more she had become. And then he came in from a day's riding, in the careless expectation of finding her where she always was, the quiet, warm center of the house, and found instead her short, honest letter in her empty rooms and the great house gone cold and dead again in the few hours of her absence, and the measure of his loss broke over him all at once. The warmth went out of Wolverton with her, and he felt it go, felt the house revert in an afternoon to the cold, dead shell it had been before she came, and understood, standing stricken in her empty apartments, that she had been the warmth, that she had thawed not only his heart but his whole life, and that, without her, he was exactly what he had been for 13 frozen years, only now he knew what he was missing. And in that desolation, the truth he had been fighting for weeks rose up and would no longer be denied. He loved her. He had loved her for weeks and had been too proud and too frightened to say it, even to himself, had let his old fear of feeling keep him from the one feeling that might have saved him, had stood by, guarding his frozen safety while a dazzling fool drove the truest thing in his life out of his house. He saw with merciless clarity the whole of his folly, how he had punished an innocent woman for a betrayal 13 years old, how he had been given, by the luckiest accident of his life, a wife of rare and perfect worth, and had called her a parcel and kept her at arm's length and let her believe herself unwanted, how she had given him, churned for his coldness, only honesty and dignity and patient goodness, and had thawed his frozen heart, without his ever once thanking her for it, and how he had repaid her, at the last, by letting her be driven away, believing herself a second-best error too proud to be kept. The shame of it and the loss of it, and the love he could no longer deny, came upon him together with the force of a breaking dam, and the Duke of Wolverton, who had not moved quickly or felt deeply in 13 years, called for his horse before the thought was fully formed, and went after his wife as a man goes after the one irreplaceable thing in his life, with no thought now for his pride, his dignity, or anything in the world but the desperate need to reach her before she was gone for good. What the Duke did then, on finding her gone, was the undoing of 13 years of frozen pride, for he went after her openly, desperately, before the whole watching world, and made of the recovering of his wrong parcel the most public and most complete renunciation of his old bitterness that any man could make. He read her letter, standing in the empty hall where he had first called her a parcel, and the reading of it broke something in him and mended something else. For he saw all at once the whole shape of what he had done and what he had nearly lost, saw that he had taken an innocent woman, sent to him by no fault of her own, and punished her for the crime of a different woman 13 years dead to him, saw that she had given him, every day of their cold marriage, exactly the honesty and goodness and steadfast worth that the betrayer of his youth had not, saw that he had been thawing all these weeks, not toward a fancy, but toward the truest thing in his life, and had been too proud and too frightened to admit it, and saw with a clarity that scoured him that he loved her, loved the wrong parcel, the substitute, the poor relation the world had reckoned worth nothing, loved her wholly, and had nearly let her walk out of his life sooner than risk the warmth he had sworn off, and he did not hesitate. He called for his horse, and he rode after her, leaving the dazzling Cynthia and the whole machinery of his cold pride behind him without a backward glance. He overtook her at the posting inn where she waited for the coach, and there, in the public room, before the landlord and the ostlers and a scattering of curious travelers, the Duke of Wolverton did the thing his old self would have died sooner than do. He humbled himself openly to a penniless dependent and asked her to come back. He told her, before all those listening strangers, that he had been a fool and worse than a fool, that he had called her the wrong parcel and had been wrong, wholly wrong, for she was the rightest thing that had ever come to him, that he had punished her for another woman's sin and starved them both for the sake of an old wound, had never for one instant since meeting her wanted Cynthia, would not have the most beautiful woman in England if he could have, instead, the honest, dignified, clever, good woman who had returned his key and closed his door and shamed him into being a man again. He asked her pardon publicly and her hand freely. He laid his pride and his bitterness and his frozen heart at her feet in the common room of a posting inn, before any who cared to look, and the watching strangers who had seen a great cold duke come storming in, saw him instead go humbly down before a plain, quiet woman in a traveling-cloak, and beg her, as the dearest wish of his life, to forgive him and come home. What the reconciliation at the posting inn was to Constance, from within her own guarded heart, deserves to be told, for it was the strangest and the sweetest reversal of her life. And the moment her long refusal to be the wrong parcel, she had been waiting in the inn's small parlor for the coach that would carry her away into an uncertain future, composed as ever on the surface and aching beneath it. For she had done the right thing, the dignified thing, the only thing her self-respect allowed, and it had cost her more than she would let herself feel. She had left behind not only the security of a great position, but the man she had, against all her resolve and all her sense, come to love, had closed the door on him for good, as she had closed it on her first day, sooner than be kept as a second-best error, and she was bracing herself for the long gray life of a woman alone in the world, with nothing to comfort her but the cold knowledge that she had kept her dignity to the end. And then the door of the parlor had burst open, and the Duke of Wolverton had stood there travel-stained and wild and utterly unlike the cold man she knew, having ridden after her as if his life depended on overtaking her. And the whole gray future had turned in an instant upside down. She could scarcely take it in, at first, that he had come after her, that he was speaking, before the staring strangers of the public room, words she had never thought to hear from any man, and least of all from him, that the cold Duke who had called her a parcel was humbling himself, openly and without reserve, to beg her pardon and her hand. And as the meaning of it broke over her, what Constance felt, beneath the wonder and the disbelief, was the deep, still joy of a vindication she had hardly dared to hope for. All her life, the world had told her she was the lesser thing, the overlooked one, the wrong parcel, and she had refused, stubbornly and at great cost, to believe it, holding to her own quiet knowledge of her own worth against all the evidence of her treatment. And now, in this inn parlor, before these strangers, the proudest man she had ever known was on his feet declaring to the world that she had been right all along, that she was not the lesser thing, but the greater, not the error, but the treasure, not the wrong parcel, but the rightest gift his life had ever received. It was the answer to 13 years of being undervalued, and Constance, hearing it, felt the long ache of being unwanted ease at last, and knew that whatever she chose to answer, she had already won the only victory that mattered. Probert played, in the crisis deserves recording, for the humble nurse who had loved the Duke since boyhood did more than anyone to set things right, speaking the plain truths in the Duke's ear that no one else dared, and helping the cause along at its darkest moment. When Cynthia came sweeping back to Wolverton with her dazzle and her designs, it was Mrs. Probert who saw most clearly what was afoot, and grieved most sharply over it. She watched the beauty's campaign with a contempt she was at no pains to hide from her fellow servants, saw exactly how it wounded the quiet Duchess she had come to love, and saw, with mounting alarm, that the master, for all his growing attachment to his wife, was too proud and too blind and too tangled in his old fears to see the danger or to defend against it. And when Constance, driven past Baring, slipped away in the grey morning, it was Mrs. Zerding, Probert, who first discovered her gone, and who did not waste a moment in lamentation but went straight to the Duke with the news, and with something more than the news. For the old nurse, who had held her tongue respectfully for 13 years, while her boy froze himself into a bitter stranger, chose that desperate moment to speak her whole heart at last. She told him plainly and without deference exactly what he had done and what he had lost, that he had been given the best wife in England and had treated her like an heir, that the quiet, honest, good woman he had let be driven from his house was worth 1,000 of the dazzling baggage who had driven her out, that she, Mrs. Probert, had watched him freeze his heart for 13 years over a worthless woman's betrayal, and had near despaired of him, and had begun to hope again only when this Duchess came and brought the warmth back into the house and into his face, and that if he let her go now, for pride or fear or folly, he would deserve the cold, empty life he would have, and would break the heart of the old woman who had reared him into the bargain. It was such a speech as only an old nurse could make to a duke and live, and it was exactly the speech the Duke of Wolverton needed to hear. It put into plain words the thing his own heart had been struggling toward. It stripped away the last of his excuses, and it sent him, stung and shamed, and at last clear-eyed out to his horse and after his wife, with old Mrs. Bride. Probert's blessing and old Mrs. Brack, Probert's tears speeding him on his way. But Constance was not a woman to be won by a grand public gesture alone, however much it cost him, and the true reconciliation was made, not in the inn's public room, but in the quiet words that passed between them after, when the Duke at last told her, plainly and humbly, the whole truth of his heart. For she heard him out in that public room with the composure that never deserted her, and when he had done, she did not fall into his arms, but asked him, quietly, and with the clear honesty that was the deepest part of her, whether he was sure, whether this was love or only the panic of a man who had nearly lost a comfortable habit, whether he wanted her, Constance, for herself, or only did not want the trouble and the scandal of losing her, for she would not, she told him, come back to be a convenience, nor a second best, nor a wrong parcel kept because returning it had grown inconvenient. She had her dignity and she would keep it. She would come back as a wife truly wanted, or she would not come back at all. And the Duke, hearing this, did the thing that finally won her. He did not bluster or protest, but answered her honesty with his own, and told her the whole truth of himself, holding nothing back. He told her of the betrayal of his youth, the love and the jilting, and the long freezing of his heart, told her how he had sworn never to trust or feel again, and had married her coldly meaning to feel nothing, and had called her a parcel out of the reopened pain of an old wound that had nothing to do with her, told her how she had, day by day, with her honesty and her dignity and her steadfast unbought worth, thawed the ice of 13 years and taught him, against all his resolve, that he had been wrong about her, wrong about women, wrong about the whole world he had condemned for one woman's crime. He told her that he did not love her in spite of her being the wrong parcel, but had learned through the having of her that she was the rightest thing his life had ever delivered, that the betrayer of his youth had taught him a lie about all women, and that she, Constance, had taught him the truth, that he wanted her herself, the honest, dignified, good woman who had returned his key, not as a convenience or a second best, but as the first and last and only choice of a heart he had thought frozen past all choosing. And Constance, listening, weighing it with the clear, honest judgment that could not be deceived, heard in his bare confession the unmistakable ring of truth, and knew that he meant it. And she found, looking into the changed face of the man who had once growled at her across a cold hall, that the wary tenderness she had guarded so long had become, somewhere in the strange weeks of their marriage, a love as deep and as honest as her own. She chose him then, freely, not as a dependent grateful to be kept nor a substitute clinging to a borrowed place, but as a free woman valued at last for her own true worth, choosing of her own will to give the love that no one had ever thought her worth the having. For Constance came back to Wolverton on her own terms, as an equal and not an error. She had returned his key once and closed his door. And now, of her own free choice, she took the key again, not as a thing grudgingly allowed her, but as a thing freely and gladly given, the key to a home she was now truly wanted in. And the door that she had closed herself against a man who did not want her, she opened herself, of her own will, to a man who did. She did not come because she had nowhere else to go, for she had shown she would sooner go penniless into the world than be kept on sufferance. She came because she was wanted, truly and wholly for herself. Came as a woman of worth, bestowing her own freely given love on a man who had learned almost too late to deserve it. The wrong parcel, sent in error and kept in resentment, became at last what she had been all along beneath the careless world's mislabeling. Not an error, not a substitute, not a thing delivered to the wrong house, but the right woman, the true gift, chosen freely and cherished wholly, come home. The first days of the true marriage, after Constance came home to Wolverton, an equal and a wife truly wanted, deserved their tender place in the telling, for they were the spring that followed a long, hard winter, and the sweeter for all the cold that had gone before. She came back, not as she had first come, unwanted, unwelcomed, an error fobbed off on a furious stranger, but as a wife sought out and brought home in honor, met at the door not by a growl, but by a husband who could scarcely believe his good fortune in having her back, and by an old nurse weeping for joy, and by a whole household that had grieved at her going and rejoiced at her return. And the marriage that began that day was a different thing entirely from the cold, strange bargain of before. The wall was down between them. Now, the honesty that had always been hers, and the trust that was newly his, met and joined and made of their union the thing it had never been able to be, while his distrust and her fear stood in the way. They could speak to each other now without guard, could be easy and warm, and themselves could build, on the firm ground of a love confessed and a trust restored, the true companionship that their wild, warm, fireside evening had once only promised. And it was a marriage that suited them both wonderfully well. For they were beneath the differences of rank and fortune the world made so much of, two people of the same essential quality, both honest, both deep, both undeceived by the surfaces the shallow world prized, and they found in each other, once the barriers fell, exactly the companion each had lacked through all their solitary years. He gave her the thing she had never had, to be valued wholly and for herself, by someone whose valuing she could trust, to lay down at last the long vigilance of the unwanted and be simply, securely loved. She gave him the thing he had thrown away 13 years before and thought gone forever, a heart he could trust, a warmth he need not fear, a love that would not betray him, gave him back his lost capacity for joy, and a home that was a home, and a companion for all the rest of his days. The wrong parcel, sent in error and kept in resentment, had become the right wife, chosen in love and held in honor. And the cold great house of Wolverton, which had known no warmth in living memory, became, under the new Duchess and her thawed and grateful Duke, one of the happiest homes in England. The years that followed, and the proof they gave that the Duke's thaw was no passing softness but a true and lasting resurrection, deserve a closing glance, for the deepest test of a healing is whether it holds, and this one held to the end of both their lives. The cynical world, which had heard with astonishment of the cold Duke of Wolverton's sudden devotion to his substitute Duchess, half expected the frost to return. Suppose that a man so long frozen could not truly change, that his old bitterness would reassert itself in time, that the warmth was a passing aberration and the ice would close over again. It did not happen. The Duke of Wolverton, once thawed, did not freeze again, for the thing that had thawed him was not a passing fancy, but the steady daily presence of a love he could trust, and that presence did not fail him. And so the warmth it gave did not fail either. Year by year he grew not colder, but warmer, not more guarded, but more open, the bitter armor of his middle years falling further from him with every season of his wife's honest love, until the warm, generous, trusting man who had been frozen at 23 stood wholly restored, with the added depth and gratitude that only a man who has been to the frozen country and come back can have. He never grew bitter again, because he was never again betrayed, and because the love that had healed him taught him, by its steady example, that his old creed had been a lie. He learned to trust not only his wife, but by degrees the world, learned that the betrayal of his youth had been one woman's crime, and not the way of all the earth. Learned to give again the warmth and the good faith he had locked away for 13 years, and found them returned 100-fold. And he and Constance grew old together at Wolverton in a deep and undimmed happiness, the warm man and the honest woman, surrounded in time by children who would never know the cold house their father had once kept, and by a household that loved them, and by tenants who blessed them, and by the quiet, undeniable proof, written in the warmth of every room of that once frozen house, that the wrong parcel had been the rightest thing ever delivered to its door, and that the careless world, which had labeled her in error, had been wrong, as the careless world so often is, about the only thing that finally mattered: the confounding of Cynthia. When the Duke's choice became plain, deserves its due, for it was the just collapse of a vain woman's whole false philosophy, and it was administered fittingly, not by any cruelty, but simply by the truth becoming undeniable. Cynthia had been so sure, she had built her whole campaign, and indeed her whole life, on the certainty that beauty was supreme, that a pretty face must always defeat a plain one, that the Duke could not fail to prefer her dazzling self to her drab cousin the moment the choice was fairly put. And so when the Duke, on discovering Constance gone, did not turn with relief to the beauty so conveniently at hand, but instead flung himself out of the house in a frenzy of distress to pursue the plain wife he had supposedly never wanted, Cynthia was left to absorb a lesson that struck at the root of everything she believed. She had expected him to be glad of Constance's flight. She found him frantic at it. She had expected to console him for the loss of an unwanted error. She found herself forgotten, brushed past, left standing in the hall in all her dazzling uselessness, while the Duke rode off after the cousin she had been so certain he despised. It was the cruelest blow her vanity had ever taken, and the most just. For Cynthia had jilted the Duke, believing she could have him back whenever she chose, had ruined her family, believing her beauty would always provide, had come to Wolverton believing she had only to appear to reclaim her place, and she was shown, in one humiliating hour, that she had been wrong in every calculation, that the Duke did not want her, had never since meeting Constance wanted her, would not have her if she were the last beauty in England, that the worth she had despised in her cousin had defeated the beauty she had gloried in, that she had thrown away a great match for a worthless lover, and could not now even recover the leavings because the plain substitute she had scorned had won. By simple worth, the heart Cynthia's beauty had failed to hold. She left Wolverton not long after, diminished and disregarded, to make what shift she could with her ruined prospects and her useless beauty. And the lesson of her fall, for any who cared to read it, was the lesson of the whole tale, that beauty without worth is a poor currency in the end, that the dazzling surface the world calls the right parcel may be the emptiest of deliveries, and that the plain, honest soul the world labels wrong may carry beneath the modest wrapping the only treasure that finally counts. The later fortunes of the Mainwarings, the family that had sent Constance off as a fraud to save itself, deserve recording, for there was a quiet justice in how things fell out, and it turned fittingly on the very worth they had been too blind to see. They had used her for 8 years, and then packed her off as a substitute bride to save their own skins, expecting, no doubt, never to think of her again, except as a problem conveniently disposed of. They had reckoned without the possibility, which would never have occurred to them, that the poor relation they despised might rise to a height from which she could look down on them all. For Constance, once she was the beloved and honored Duchess of Wolverton, found herself in a position the Mainwarings had never dreamed of, the most consequential member by far of the whole connection, a great lady whose notice they now craved as anxiously as they had once dispensed their cold charity to her. The wheel had turned with a vengeance. The family that had treated her as a dependent of no account now found their own consequence bound up in the favor of the kinswoman they had used, and they were obliged, with what grace they could muster, to court the regard of the woman they had once thought they were doing a great kindness merely to feed. And here Constance showed the quality that set her so far above them, for she might have repaid their long contempt with the cold contempt they had taught her, might have used her new height to humble the family that had humbled her, and no one could have blamed her for it. But that was not her way, for she was not a small soul, and revenge was no part of her nature. She did not cut the Mainwarings, nor crush them, nor lord her good fortune over them. She treated them, instead, with a calm, civil kindness that was its own quiet rebuke, helping them where help was genuinely needed, holding them at the distance their conduct had earned, but never stooping to the pettiness they would have shown in her place. It was a more crushing answer than any revenge could have been, for it showed them every time they met her exactly the magnanimity they lacked, and made them feel, more sharply than any reproach, the smallness of their own past treatment of so generous a woman. The poor relation they had used became the most honored of the whole family, and the most generous, and the proof, written in her own conduct, of how badly they had misjudged the worth that had lived all those years unregarded under their own roof. And here, before the fire burns quite down, it is worth pausing over the deepest meaning of the wrong parcel and the right one, for it is a truth that reaches far beyond the tale of one duke and one despised cousin. Consider how the whole story turned upon a labeling. The world had labeled Cynthia the right parcel, beautiful, well-born, the contracted bride, everything the careless eye prizes, and Constance the wrong one. Poor, plain, overlooked, sent in error, a substitute of no account. And the world was exactly completely wrong, for it had read only the wrapping and never the contents, judged only the surface and never the worth within. The dazzling parcel it called right proved hollow, a beautiful wrapping around vanity and selfishness and a shallow, cruel heart, and the modest parcel it called wrong proved to hold the only treasure that finally counted, a soul of honesty and dignity and deep good worth, the rarest and the best of goods beneath the plainest of coverings. The Duke, at first, read the labels as the world read them, and rejected the right gift as an error, and it was only when he learned to read past the wrapping to the worth within that he discovered what had been delivered to his door, and knew it, at last, for the treasure it was. And the truth of it is a truth for every soul that the careless world has mislabeled. For the world is forever sorting people into right parcels and wrong, prizing the dazzling wrapping and despising the plain, delivering its judgments on the strength of a glance at the surface. And it is forever wrong, forever overlooking the deep worth in the modest covering and overvaluing the emptiness in the bright one. If the world has labeled you a wrong parcel, too poor, too plain, too quiet, too overlooked, not the one anyone was looking for, take heart from Constance Fenwick, and remember that the world is a careless and a hasty reader, and that its labels are not the truth of you. The truth of you is the worth within, which no careless hand can label and no contemptuous eye can see, and which waits only for the eyes that can truly read to be known, at last, for the gift it is. The wrong parcel was the right one all along. So, very likely are you. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the dark draw gentle and close. A bitter man called a frightened woman the wrong parcel, and she returned his key and closed his door. And by the end he had learned that she was the rightest thing ever delivered to his door, and begged her, before all the world, to open it again. They lived long and happily, the Duke and his Duchess. The warm man she had thawed out of the frozen one, the honest woman who had taught him to trust, and the dazzling cousin who had thought herself the right parcel went her diminished way. And the family that had sent Constance as a fraud lived to see their poor relation become the most honored of them all. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have sat with a woman the world labeled wrong and a man who learned, almost too late, that she was right. And I am glad of it, more glad than I can say, and I should dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from. Remember, when next the careless world tries to tell you that you are the wrong parcel, too poor, too plain, too overlooked, sent in error, not the one anyone wanted, that the world is a careless reader of labels and often delivers its truest treasures to those too foolish at first to know what they have received, and that you are no parcel at all, to be reckoned right or wrong, but a soul of your own worth which the eyes that truly see will know, at last, for the gift it is. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.